This is Webster Tarpley speaking to you from Washington, D.C., and it is Veterans Day, the 11th of November, 2016. Veterans Day, originally Armistice Day, the end of the First World War on the Western Front. On that day, November 11th, 1918, at 11 o'clock. And it reminds us what the stakes are in politics, especially in the modern world, in the nuclear age in particular. The great goal of policy has got to be to avoid armed conflict and to refrain from destabilizations and regime changes that might precipitate armed conflict. It is therefore a grim and a somber day. Many observed the moment of silence, which has been traditional since 1918. President Obama was at the Tomb of the Unknowns at Arlington National Cemetery. It is a somber time. Progress in history is generally not linear. Progress in history often proceeds by one step, two steps forward, let's hope it's two steps forward, and one step back. And we may, at the moment, be caught in a one step back situation. I'm going to try to situate this entire issue of where we are in world history. That's the theme of my program today. Let me just remind you of a couple of durable truths. It's Armistice Day, and that reminds us of the tremendous slaughter of World War I on the Western Front in particular. Countries like France have demographically never recovered. Europe has really never recovered. And in addition to this, we also have to remember the senseless butchery by General John Pershing, who forced the American army to keep attacking until literally 11 o'clock in the morning on November 11th, 1918. And he was asked, why didn't you, spare the lives of these people once the armistice had been decided and scheduled? Why didn't you just go into a waiting defensive mode? And his answer was completely spurious. 100 years ago today, it was the Battle of Verdun on the Meuse River in eastern France that was winding down from having started in February. It's generally considered to have gone from February to December. And that was one of the biggest, most bloody, and to be sure, I think the longest battle in recent human history. A couple of things to bear in mind. The fundamental truth of our age is get active or get radioactive. Your consternation, your sorrow, your disappointment are not worth anything in world historical terms. It's time to deal with them, but to cater to them, to preserve them, is not the goal. Never take counsel of your fears, and never make important decisions if you're feeling demoralized. Right? Go take a couple of days off, get plenty of sleep, take some vitamins, feel better, and eventually the positive outlook will return. We also remember the celebrated formula, which might apply to our current situation. You may have to proceed with the pessimism of the intellect, but if you do, you must temper that by the optimism of the will. Nothing good happens unless somebody does it. Somebody has to want it. And we have to have positive action, purposeful action. We are dealing now with the moment, I was thinking of it this morning, the Great Fear. The Great Fear, originally July 1789, the Great Fear that invested the French countryside in the midst of the French Revolution. And what it eventually led to was the abolition of feudalism and the manorial system in France. It accomplished something. But what we're dealing with now is a great fear. some of the things that are feared may happen, although I don't think any of them is automatic. Probably the most serious is, will there be 12 million deportations? Because as we've stressed, that will mean holding cages, that will mean camps, essentially. I venture to guess that this will be much harder to do. And the reason I say this is we have our American institutions, right? This constitutional government, the fact that the Constitution of the United States is rooted in the people and lives among the people gives us a kind of resilience that Italy in 1922 did not have, that monarchy, an oligarchy, which had been fighting a guerrilla war in southern Italy and in Sicily for many decades. They didn't have that resilience, and certainly not the Weimar Republic in 1933, where many of the political parties rejected the Weimar Constitution. And of course, what we now have is the test of a group of people who have expressed, let's say, minimum regard for the Constitution, are now taking over the levers of power. But that doesn't change the federal system under which states can resist policies, if necessary, coming from Washington, and also the inherent tension and conflict among the branches of government. I suggest that we're going to see quite a lot of that between the White House and the ideologues in the House of Representatives. That will be a real fight. We'll get into that in a minute. But let's talk about fear. I can see liberal columnists and so forth are talking about fear. Harry Reid, the outgoing minority leader in the Senate, has talked about a tide of hate, that Americans are now living in fear. I would urge people to essentially put aside the fear, or better yet, take that emotional energy and use it in constructive political activity. But let's also talk about our emotions, right? Creativity presupposes that you are aware of your emotions, right? So let's talk about some bad times. I'll tell you about some bad times that I lived through. I've told this story on The American System, which I want you to subscribe to. Go there, americansystem.tv, americansystem.tv. You can hear more of my personal odyssey through this world. But I can remember sleeping in Ithaca, New York, up there in College Town, near Cornell University, where I was teaching at the time. It was the middle of the Vietnam War. There was a war going on. We had just had not just the Kennedy assassination years before, but in 1968, we had had the Robert Kennedy assassination, the Martin Luther King assassination, and I personally had gone to Chicago in August to protest the Democratic Party's support for the Vietnam War, and that was going to be passed on from Lyndon B. Johnson to Hubert Horatio Humphrey. Humphrey broke with the Johnson people on the war issue at the end, but it was too little too late. And Nixon, certainly one of the greatest unprincipled adventurers in American life, up to now, certainly, was going to take over. It was the morning, cold morning, upstate New York, right? Southern Finger Lakes, the wind coming down Lake Cayuga over to College Town. January 20th, 1969, about 5 or 6 a.m., I woke up and thought, oh my God, this is the first day of the Nixon era. And it was scary. And I'll tell you what happened back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. We have already referred to our Monday through Thursday service for all of you out there. That is the American System on the air. You got to go to americansystem.tv. Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, americansystem.tv. Go to americansystem.tv and subscribe so you can listen to us every day. We'll keep you chipper. We will help you to buck up. We will show you the great, vast objectivity of world history where the wheels are turning, and certainly not all bad. Again, progress is always available. It's not automatic. It's not linear, but you can get it What you need is a political party dedicated to progress, that's not afraid to say progress for all the people, for the nation. And that does not mean a collection of identity politics or interest groups. We'll talk about this more in a minute. Anyway, there I was in Ithaca, New York, in that cold morning of January 20th, 1969, wondering if they would come to knock on the door, that LBJ and Nixon had made a deal where they would share the responsibility on that day, right? Because LBJ was president until noon. And would they come and round us up? Because I'd been out there in the streets in Chicago, photographed, right, all this stuff. And, well, the long and the short is, it didn't happen, did it? It didn't happen. We had some pretty rough times, but there was nothing like a mass roundup. So I would tend to push this away. Let me also recall, I think one of the most prolonged periods of pessimism and depression for a lot of people was in after November 2004. In other words, after George W. Bush defeated Secretary Kerry, or Senator Kerry, as he was then. There was a period, that winter of 2004 to 2005 was just excruciating. And one of the people who brought you that, right? Remember Ken Blackwell? Ken Blackwell, the Secretary of State from Ohio, who some would say did not do an honest count. Right? I don't think he did an honest count, but what do I know? So Ken Blackwell, who's now back on the transition team, we're told, and this was done tremendous disorientation. One of the main people in the 9/11 truth movement took that moment to say that the 9/11 and anti-terror and anti-war issues were dead, and that was only peak oil was the only thing left. And that poor guy carried out his pessimism to the point of suicide a couple of years ago. So pessimism is a bad horse, right? The entire logic of America is optimism, right? You're going to cross the Atlantic, set up a new civilization, and be optimistic. You can't be American and pessimistic. That just will not work. So this is not crippled America. The military is not a mess. The generals are not a shambles. We are not impotent. We are not doomed. We are not passing from the world stage. None of that. So, you know, with Bush also, when Bush invaded Iraq, right, a year earlier, 2003, there was an idea that after he had defeated the Iraqi military and occupied the entire country, there could have been some idea of authoritarian solutions, right? And this, of course, was the time of the Patriot Act and a lot of surveillance and a lot of fear. So think back to those difficult moments, and you will see that some of them are worse, right? The ones during the Vietnam War had in 1969, there were 400,000 or 500,000 U.S. troops in South Vietnam, and that was a terrible time, right? Inside the cone of fire at Con Thien and Khe Sanh and so forth. With George W. Bush, there was the Iraq War, and there was even the theorizing of essentially dictatorship, right? The unitary executive. We've had all of that. So try to temper whatever fear you have with the case of these historical examples they're scary in themselves, but they should be comforting because they didn't lead to the end of the world. As a matter of fact, I'm going to go on record right now and say, of all the elections in my lifetime that were supposed to lead to the end of the world, I go back to 1952. I go back to essentially the Republican convention, Eisenhower against Taft, when I was supporting Eisenhower in 1952. But all of these elections and all of that time, none of them has brought the end of the world. So far, so good. And let's hope that skein, right, that streak can be continued. Now, what do you do about Trump? Well, again, this is negative. This is a step backwards, I would say. This is, it has undoubted dangers. Let's not kid ourselves about that. But it may not be as bad as you think because precisely of these institutions. Remember, the genius of the institutions is Machiavelli, above all, our founding father, to try to channel the competing impulses into the government so it can be resolved there without conflict. Right? Suppose this had been the election of 1860 with Buchanan outgoing and God knows who coming in. Well, it was Lincoln. But that was a much scarier situation. And of course, that did lead to the end of the world somehow with the Civil War. But other than that, we've essentially been able to keep the ship of state going. It's Machiavelli translated into the Massachusetts Constitution by John Adams, and then fleshed out with a system of federal states. And we're even told that there are people out west. It's interesting that this guy Villaraigosa running for mayor, well, he's mayor of Los Angeles, wants to be governor of California. He's in the process of trying to mobilize civil rights forces, Hispanic forces, all kinds of progressive forces. So that might be good. And remember, when there was the Dred Scott decision and the fugitive slave law, well, there were then in many states personal liberty laws. So let's see about them. But right now, what do you do about Trump? Do we hope he succeeds? Do we hope he fails? Remember, last time around, Limbaugh went on the radio and said, Obama, I hope you fail. 08 and 12. How about Mitch McConnell? My main mission, said Mitch, is to prevent Obama from winning a second term. That he failed in. And then he said, I'm going to oppose anything he proposes because Mitch McConnell said we Republicans don't want Obama to have any legislative victories. Now, I would say both of those are inadequate. Obviously, there can be no question of hoping the current president-elect succeeds, or that he gets reelected, or that his popularity stays at 90% or whatever it is. No, not this. But on the other hand, there are other things that can be done. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Crisis Radio, Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. So you don't want to say that you want the Republican president-elect to succeed. No, that's not the idea. But at the same time, you don't want to go into the Mitch McConnell position. In other words, you're not going to be there saying, no matter what is proposed, I'm going to be against it. In other words, the spiteful position, the position that clearly puts party above country. I would suggest that there are two areas where progress might even be possible under these difficult conditions. One is relations with Russia. Now, we have never confused Russia with Trump, and we are in favor of good relations with Russia. We would say in particular that we've gone further than any of these Republicans, that there should be a condominium. There should be a United States-Russia condominium, and that should immediately put an end to the Syrian civil war by pulling the rug out from under the terrorist rebels that have been backed by the CIA up to now. The Nusra, Al-Qaeda, as well as the somewhat uncertain opposition by the U.S. against ISIS, right? So those people have to go. No more Nusra, no more Al-Qaeda, no more ISIS. Now, we've got armies advancing towards Mosul, another army advancing towards Raqqa. So those CIA guys, and also, I would say, the CIA gang in Kiev and in Lvov, right, in Lviv, those guys, we cannot tie ourselves to them. So I would say that it would be reasonable at this point, first of all, to say to Russia, lift the economic sanctions, right? Convince the Europeans, lift the economic sanctions against Russia. And then, if all goes well, a year or so down the road, or a year and a half, it might clearly be time to say, okay, the Crimea really is part of Russia, always has been, that in the the breakup of the Soviet Union, things went too far, so the Crimea can go back, and Donetsk and Lugansk may also be restored to Russia, right? Have a plebiscite, have a referendum, ask what they want. There's a kind of artificiality in the Ukrainian state, right? These are things that Khrushchev gave them, don't necessarily need to gum up the works of world history. So I would do the economic sanctions, away with them right now, and then prepare to allow Russia to peacefully hold on to some of these places. Now, the thing that I also would do, though, is you need some tripwire troops. You got to have token forces, right? Think of the Berlin Brigade during the Cold War, right? The Berlin Brigade was militarily not viable, but as a political symbol and tripwire, it was eminently viable, and it was not attacked. And it meant something, and it was important and worth doing. And that's what I would do now, right? As much as I dislike the politics of Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, give them some tripwire troops. Same thing for Poland, same thing for Bulgaria, and some other places, right? By the way, you'd be cooling down Europe. If you could put an end to the Syrian civil war, you could essentially make that wave of refugees go into reverse. So have some tripwire troops and essentially let the whole thing cool down. Why not negotiate with Russia a convention that says no more color revolutions and no more hybrid warfare, some kind of an amicable basis? Now, I'm afraid, though, that Sergei, the economist Sergei Glaziev, has gone a little bit too far, saying that if Hillary Clinton had been elected, that would have been automatic World War III. I'm afraid the risks are more equally divided or distributed than Mr. Glaziev seems to appreciate. We won't go through it now, but historically, the Russian ability to predict events in the Western world, starting in the 1920s, has not been good. And I think this is an example where it's not good, because we remember that the current president-elect has said 3 times, if we have nuclear weapons, why can't I use them? He has called for a no-fly zone over Syria, and he has essentially used a lot of violent rhetoric about what kind of bombing is going to take place in Iraq and Syria. And I think just the notion of being an impulsive personality, that ought to chasten some of the people who think they have a crystal ball. So with Mrs. Clinton, it's clear. We said this here many times. Mrs. Clinton's problem, and it really hurt her, was that people thought she was a warmonger, right? There was a line of argument that said she would start World War III. Now, we didn't want to go that far, because precisely what's the question, right? Somebody is bureaucratic and cautious, and somebody else is impulsive and bombastic. You have to measure those outcomes. We urged Mrs. Clinton to offer a peace pledge. We said, Hillary, you should make a speech where you say you've been studying the Constitution and you've now come around to the idea that the only way to have military action is to get a declaration of war from the Congress, and that you were prepared and you're going to pledge to respect that norm. Well, she didn't do what I said. And when I did that, some people said, oh, that's silly. What are you doing? Doesn't look so silly in retrospect, right? After you lose the election, maybe you realize that some ideas that might have changed the outcome were not so bad after all. So Russia is one thing. The other one is obviously infrastructure. We want to, I think Trump sees that the U.S. airports are inferior to those in the rest of the world. He's absolutely right. Rebuild them and do all of that other work, the superhighways, the water systems, the rail of all types, and so forth. But on this one, if you get a standalone bill on infrastructure, that would be wonderful. I would tend to vote for that. Now, naturally, it's so much better if the Federal Reserve provides the financing. We might be able to do an action on this and even convince some of these Republicans saying, what are you, the Federal Reserve Republican Party? You don't like the Federal Reserve. Why don't you force the Federal Reserve to give these 100-year 0% financing, buy the bonds, and get that going, right? And how about $5 trillion for starters? But it's unlikely that that will happen without some powerful stuff. One deal, I can imagine Pence and Ryan saying to Trump, hey, look, we'll give you infrastructure, but we want to take the money out of Social Security and Medicare, and that will not fly. Or we're going to tie the infrastructure to the tax cuts for the rich, right? The business tax goes from 35 to 15, and all those guys who hoarded money abroad goes down from 35 to 15 or 10 or whatever it is. So the two things, right? The two obvious areas where, good results might be obtained, or some results: Russia, peace, Syria, and infrastructure. And again, a clean bill. Why not? You said you wanted infrastructure. You didn't say, I want infrastructure if the House Freedom Caucus is willing to go along, because this is secret. I think some of the biggest conflicts in this new administration will be between the Trump White House and guys like Ryan. Right? Take a look at that that pamphlet, A Better Way by Ryan, and you will be chilled. There are going to be conflicts, and ironically, Trump is going to be the better of the two. Trump is going to be the lesser evil if he gets into a fight with ideologues like Pence and Ryan, because Pence, of course, comes from the Koch orbit. Ryan, as I've always said, comes from the political culture of the John Birch Society. So those guys are ideologues. They don't care about Trump. Trump has to care about Trump, and if he wants to be popular, he's got to deliver massive infrastructure. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Armistice Day, Veterans Day, post-election version. And we mean to offer no uncertain trumpet. So if you find the stresses going on, restoration of relations with Russia, the refusal of the United States to be dictated to by these turbulent little ethnic revenge parties in Eastern Europe. We don't want that. That'll be okay. Good relations with Russia are needed, and the infrastructure program is needed. But at what price? Again, if it's saying somebody says we're going to gut Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, no. And the entitlements, of course, have to be expanded, not cut. If we see a special prosecutor to arrest Hillary Clinton, as has been widely mooted, that will be a very bad sign. If there's a serious commitment to deporting 12 million people, that will be a very bad sign. If there's an attempt to gut Obamacare, that will be a very bad sign. So those things you have to oppose. Get ready to oppose those, but don't be blind to positive things that might come out in the mix. Because again, if we have Trump in an ideological clash with Ryan and Pence and that whole Republican group from the House, then that's going to weaken the combine, right? So there you go. So you want to get involved in those things. Now, forget about sociological explanations, right? This is not a sociological election. This is tactical. We'll get to that in just a second. There is no populist wave. It's a very narrow victory. Hillary won the electoral, the popular vote, right? The actual vote cast by people, popular vote. So there is no deep sociological lesson about shifting ethnic groups or any of this other stuff. The explanation is tactical. There is no populist wave. This is a minority presidency. It's a minority presidency, and it comes in widely regarded as being subject to exorbitant influence by foreign powers. And that's unavoidable, right? That's based on what happened. Now, in terms of people talking about normalization, no, I wouldn't say normalization. I think what we need is extraordinary activism and vigilance to defend liberty, right? The price of liberty is eternal vigilance, and that's what it is right now. Naturally, the influence of so-called white nationalists, of the alt-right, and similar people, even white supremacists, this has got to be defeated. And that simply will not fly in the America of the 21st century. Forget about persecuting Mrs. Clinton. Let's hope that we don't have an attempt similar to what Bush and Gonzalez did in 2006 to purge the U.S. attorneys. Watch that closely. But otherwise, let's take a look and see why this all happened. And again, I don't see this as sociology. I don't see this as the white lash or anything of the sort. There's some very clearly identifiable causes. Now, obviously, I don't have a crystal ball. And if you look at my last statement before the election, I said this can either take us into the consolidation and completion of the seventh party system, in other words, the Democratic majority, or a majority of that type, or it can be aborted into an authoritarian state. And that question is still open. And it's not going to be the Democratic Party presiding over the extinction of the Republican Party. It could have been. The extinction of the Republican Party was within reach. And some people said, oh no, I'm going to stay home. And I'll tell you, the people who voted for Gary Johnson and Jill Stein, in my book, are prize fools. And they have a tremendous historical responsibility for this, right? With their, don't vote for the lesser evil, vote for the greater good. That is absolutely ridiculous. Now, see what you have now. You buttered your bread, now you sleep in it. But let's put this all in context. The causes for the Democratic defeat. First of all, more than anything, Comey of the FBI. I've been listening to these rehashes, postmortems, what have you, NPR this morning. They didn't mention the FBI and Comey until somebody called in. It's Comey and his meddling, his stupid and treacherous letter of the Friday, right, before the election, right, a week before the election, pre-election weekend, talking about these emails and the constant stress on the emails. But Comey, with his two letters, the first one saying, we've got these emails, we're going to find out what it is, dear House Republicans. Is that where the power is now going to be, with Ryan and Pence? And then the so-called Breitbart cell in the New York FBI field office, which I think we can say is somewhat under the inspiration of Giuliani, and perhaps also of Christie, because remember Christie, who has now been unceremoniously booted, Christie was somebody who had a career in the Justice Department. He was a prosecutor, and I'm sure his influence on that stuff was also felt somehow. So the first and main point is meddling by the secret police in the outcome of an election. And this is absolutely out of this world. The second one is like unto the first. The abolition of the Voting Rights Act, the gutting of the Voting Rights Act by the malevolent Antonin Scalia as one of his final Parthian shots against the Constitution that he was supposed to serve. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was gutted, and it meant that not just North Carolina, but Texas and a whole series of other states were free to cut down on the number of early voting days, cut down on the number of polling places, cut down on the hours, make it a harassment gauntlet to go and vote. And again, North Carolina, 150,000 votes, 200,000 votes. That's the Voting Rights Act, right? So just chalk that up. The third point, the television executives of Madison Avenue in New York, in Midtown, gave the Republican president-elect $3 billion, by my guess, my estimate, of free television time. That is how he overwhelmed his adversaries during the Republican primary, and that kept him going. This was uncommented, unrefuted, unbalanced. It was simply the spiel coming out of the television. They claim they did it for money. I'm sure they did, but I think they also had ulterior motives, because a lot of these people would like to see a government of the billionaires, by the billionaires, and for the billionaires. And that may be what we're going to get. Another point, the WikiLeaks question. Right? The WikiLeaks was a constant drumbeat, a constant water torture, drip, drip, drip in the background. These emails were inconsequential, but they showed, I think, the impotence of the U.S. government, certainly Obama, and of the Clinton networks, right? That Assange WikiLeaks thing should have been shut down. It should have been taken off the air, one way or another. The NSA is supposedly supreme in this area. Why didn't they go in there and just stop this stuff from coming forward? And if they can't do it, they better get ready, because in any real conflict, that's exactly one of the things that would happen. Connected to the WikiLeaks is a separate, but it's separate, is the constant fixation of the media, that they were willing to comment on these emails. They were willing to, with a straight face, research them, accept them, and let that all go forward as if these were reliable sources. And they, obviously, a number of these emails were doctored, they were plagiarized, they were falsified, right? Whatever they were. And we'll be back in just a minute on World Crisis Radio. World Crisis Radio, Webster, Tarpley here in Washington, D.C., right? We are your first line of defense for the First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to organize. So organize, let's do the analysis why the Democrats lost. And it's not this sociological fakery. These are very clearly identifiable tactical questions. A lot of them come down to the interference of intelligence agencies in the election. So remember, number one was Comey, the Breitbart cell in the New York FBI, Giuliani's influence, right? What did they have to do with those Comey letters that obviously shocked the entire situation? Maybe the Democrats would be in control of the Senate right now if Comey had kept his mouth shut. You don't want to do sociology and say this is because this ethnic group is now disaffected or whatever it is. Number two, the Voting Rights Act. Right? Gutted, destroyed, thanks to Scalia and company. So those people now who might have voted for Hillary in North Carolina, they couldn't do it. The black community, as we saw. $3 billion in free television from the TV networks. MSNBC, one of the worst. CNN, also very bad. Fox, you'd expect. The fourth, the WikiLeaks. How was this allowed to happen? How come cyber assets were not used to simply stop this, right? Shut it down, reach in, and so forth. The press fixation on the emails, giving them credibility, organizing from day to day about it. And of course, this is Matt Lauer already on that aircraft carrier at the commander-in-chief, where he's supposed to ask about the qualities of a commander-in-chief, and all they can talk about is emails. The Washington Post, for once, was right to say, the Hillary Clinton email scandal is out of control. Stop it. You're destroying the country. And, well, you see the result. Then, we've already mentioned Gary and Jill. Gary Johnson, the candidate from Aleppo, and Jill Stein of the Green Party, they have, between them, they've repeated the feat of Ralph Nader in 2000, opening the gates to the Republican candidate. And that is a shameful record, right? I think these political parties ought to become Typhoid Mary from now on. Right? Don't go near them. We've also got to face the fact that Democrats are not exactly the best fighters. For example, Bernie, you wanted Bernie to be the nominee. Bernie didn't fight for the nomination. He went out there and said, and this is just a matter of practical politics, right? We don't care about your damn emails. He could have been fighting on other points. He eventually worked himself up. By the time the race was lost, he began to mount a certain kind of an attack, but it never worked. Hillary Clinton, I would say also, we've seen it in the last couple of weeks, she didn't fight in the way that she could have. She talked about temperament. Temperament? What is temperament? You need to talk about something rather more powerful, more vigorous than that. Temperament is not going to conjure up fears. Now, she had some advertising that was more realistic, but generally speaking, it was not a serious effort, but more constrained. In other words, feeling, for example, after the second Comey letter, well, if I mention this, then that's going to remind people of emails. In other words, it's timidity. It's the unwillingness or incapability to seize the offensive. Now, that's, I think, one obvious problem, right? And again, Obama, the obvious thing with Obama should have been fire Comey. Fire him right away. Don't talk about his 10-year term. Nobody has a 10-year term if the president of the United States and the head of the executive branch says, you are out. Fire Comey. It didn't happen. I would also go back and say we wouldn't be in this situation. When Scalia died back in February, Obama could easily have appointed somebody with a recess appointment, and it could have been Merrick Garland, or it could have been somebody else, but you would have had a reasonable centrist or moderate, or better than that. But you notice Obama did not use the moment. When Scalia died, the Republicans were unprepared. He could have had a recess appointment, and that would go until the end of next year, and that would have changed a lot of things. Because after the first year, who knows what the current president-elect will be able to do or not able to do. All right, Obama. Now we've got an interesting testimony here from Debbie Dingell, right? The daughter, I guess, of Congressman John Dingell. This is the Michigan 12 in the House of Representatives. I would just say, even before we get to that, Obama ran in 2012. He said that he was a populist, an economic populist, and that he was running against Mitt Romney. And they were talking about Mitt Romney and Bain Capital. And when Mitt Romney came to town, the factory was shut down, and the Bain Capital people came in and asset stripped all the assets and so forth. There was no follow-through in the second term. Where were the anti-hedge fund, anti-Wall Street proposals? They simply weren't there. And now we harvest the sad fruit of not sustaining that attack that worked against Mitt. But you got to then deliver. You got to do something. I would also say working people were watching when Scott, when Governor, the governor of Wisconsin, started his union busting crusade, and we had those demonstrations at the state capitol and so forth. There should have been U.S. Marshals in there to see if people were being deprived of their civil rights. Right? Scott Walker was able to run wild. I don't know if the Department of Labor, Hilda Solis, has anybody heard from her? Did she get out there and fight? Didn't she want to go there and join the demonstration as Secretary of Labor of the United States? So I think that was a real letdown. And we're also told Flint, Michigan. When Obama went to Flint, he drank a glass of the water to try to convince people that it's safe. Well, of course, it's not safe. What was that? This reminds me of somebody like Christine Todd Whitman saying after 9/11 in New York, the air is safe to breathe. It was not. But in this case, it's the Democratic Party. So there's a gap where there should have been coherent anti-Wall Street action, reform action, continued into the second term. We don't get it. And I and a lot of people are grateful to Obama that he avoided war in the second term, which would have been the result of following the advice of Petraeus, Hillary Clinton, and so forth. But that wasn't enough. In other words, it had to be positive. Remember that the great rule is that success in politics, to be durable, has to be based on mass traction, class-based, anti-austerity economic demands. This is one of the main failings of Hillary Clinton. She let the anti-Trump and deplorable and temperamentally unfit, that pushed aside the question of free college. I would have suggested, you see Hillary's campaign banner, right, that we're stronger together. What does that even mean? I would have, forget stronger together, put free college, the promise of upward mobility, a better life, and national rebirth, I guess you'd have to say. In other words, a comeback by the United States. If everybody went to college, we wouldn't be in this situation. We can explain this in any number of ways. So we've done Gary and Jill. We've done Obama falling down in the second term. And then we got two more, and we'll be right back with those. Tarpley, Washington, D.C., 11/11/2016, Veterans Day. So we're just going through why the Democrats lost. A lot of these were unforced errors. The third term question, well, again, what was the last Democratic transfer where you had a two-term Democratic president followed by another Democratic president? You got to go back to Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren. So it goes from 1828 to 1836, the election, and then Van Buren out. That's pretty much it. It's very hard to keep this going unless you're Franklin D. Roosevelt. He did it. He did it personally, right? He kept going through four. Why could he do that? Because he had mass traction, class-based, anti-austerity economic demands. He was providing insurance, security, full employment, wages and hours, unemployment insurance, all this stuff. So Democrats, forget about your identity politics groups and your interest groups for long enough to formulate some mass traction nationwide economic demands for all the people. And then if you've got them in your platform, because if you look, there are some in the Democratic platform, and there are even some in the Hillary Clinton program. There are some good things there, but she never talked about it. She didn't campaign on it. This was a sort of a dead letter, right, in these documents. All right, so the third term. Now, what other mistakes did Hillary Clinton make? I'll tell you some that I figured out on my own, and then I'll add some from Debbie Dingell. Hillary Clinton needed to take the advice of the Black Caucus, and we said it at the time, take the advice of Butterfield and John Lewis and focus on the states where you can win in depth. You can get your electoral college majority nailed down, and you can also help those candidates further down. So you're talking about winning the presidency and the House and the Senate. Obviously, if you can get Comey to shut up for a while. So we got all of that. They were thinking about, we can go to Georgia, we can go to Utah, we can go to Arizona, we can go to all these places. It's all a pipe dream, ridiculous, a chimera, especially with the contributions from Comey in the background. So that didn't work, and that was absolutely a waste of resources. You needed more get out the vote, not less. And of course, the other things that Hillary Clinton did wrong, we're acutely aware that she didn't campaign hard and fight hard for the Rust Belt. The old Rust Bucket was somehow not a big priority. And, this is what we hear from Debbie Dingell. Debbie Dingell in the Washington Post today says that she was warning. This is a congresswoman from Michigan, political family, at home in the Rust Bucket. And Michigan, remember, they went for Bernie Sanders. That should have been an idea that they wanted something more radical. And above all, they needed attention, right? You got the students of Ann Arbor. You've got the Muslim population of Dearborn. She talks about the downrivers, I guess downriver communities south of Detroit. What I'm thinking of is River Rouge, right? Because when you take that interstate into Detroit, you got this huge River Rouge plant, or you did, left over from Henry Ford. So a lot of these places wanted Bernie. They needed special attention. They didn't get it, not even from Bill. And what she complains about is that the Clinton campaign did not go into the state. They did not visit a union hall. They did not visit a university, right? Ann Arbor or Wayne State or any of the others. And they neglected the entire array, right? Union hall, Muslims, students. So Debbie Dingell says that she was trying to tell the Clintons this stuff, that she had gone around to Rotary clubs and so forth, and she was dismissed of saying, "Wow, that's old Debbie. She's nuts. It's all hyperbole." So never stopped on a campus, never went to a union hall, never talked to the Arab American community. Sanders was in the district 10 times during the primary. Hillary, nothing. And the Clinton people had this calculation saying, well, we're going to go where the early voting is, so we get them to go right away. But that meant that you didn't get into Michigan until the last weekend. And she's saying that she took Bill Clinton shopping, but by that time it was too little and way too late. So we also had, let's also remember, Biden did his own tour, right? He went to Scranton. He went to these places because he could tell that there was danger there too. And we covered this. And we said you should listen to Biden because he's telling you that you have to pay some attention to white workers. Yes, indeedy. Blue-collar white workers. And deplorable? Yeah, some are deplorable, but this will not do. You've got to campaign, and this was our constant note. Mass traction, class-based, anti-austerity economic demands. Blaming Russia was also not such a good thing because it made you look weak, right? That the Russians are interfering, supposedly, and the National Security Agency can't shut down a few servers controlled by Assange, the conduit of this stuff. Well, again, these are all interesting problems. Again, I would say the main thing is the structure of the Democratic Party is now obsolete. The structure of the Democratic Party is that of a collection of identity politics groups. Everybody knows. Women, the LGBTQ, the black community, Black Lives Matter, the Hispanic community too, plus lawyers, plus radical environmentalists, plus some other groups. This will not work because they're the way it is now, they're incapable of fathoming a challenge to the entire nation because they just don't see it that way. And they cannot generate the economic populism we need. This is the big thing. We're told there's a populist wave. Well, that's cultural populism. That is essentially a member of the elites breaking off from the elites, from the oligarchy, as I would say, more accurate, and trying to say, look, I'm your oligarch who's an antidote to the other oligarchs. In other words, I'll be your oligarchical champion. This never ends well. Seldom ends well. Maybe with our institutions, it won't be that bad. But the Democrats don't formulate. They can formulate, but they cannot project this unitary thing of free college for everybody. That probably would have done it by itself. Forget Stronger Together. Do free college. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. Now, how about the famous party systems, the party realignment, right? Remember, the sixth party system, despite what Wikipedia will tell you, the sixth party system ended in 2008. We have been in the seventh party system. We are still trying to consolidate that, right? Don't believe these things where they say, well, the Supreme Court is now an open and shut case. It may not be. There may be defections, there may be filibusters, there may be crises, there may be suitors, right? In other words, they might put somebody in there who turns out to be a patriot and not an Austrian school ideologue or anti-democratic ideologue. So get ready to fight, but don't think that, for the next 100 years they're going to be reactionaries dominating the Supreme Court, right? Remember, Roosevelt broke the power of the clique, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, by saying, if you don't come around, I'm going to pack the court. And he lost the court packing, but eventually the Supreme Court follows the presidential election returns. Let me repeat that. The Supreme Court follows the presidential election returns. I'm thanking Mr. Gusoff in Flushing High School back about 1960 to 1961, who wrote that on the board, right? The Supreme Court follows the presidential election returns sooner or later. Now, so what happened? Remember that these party systems, right, they tend to last 36, 40 years, and don't despair, the party system has flipped as of 2008. We're in the seventh system. The question is, are we going to get anywhere, right? Can we consolidate this? Now remember, in every one of these systems, there are exceptions. For example, the New Deal system, 1932 to 1968. Who's the big exception? Dwight Eisenhower from 52 to 60, Republican. It was a hiatus, right? It was a gap in this period of Democratic nomination, right? Roosevelt, Truman, and then after him, Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson, and so forth, until the coming of Nixon. So the theory does include, obviously, the fact that there are exceptions, right? In the first system, Washington, Adams those were exceptions in a system later dominated by the Jeffersonians. So what does it look like now? Suppose we look at 1968, right, when the sixth party system at that time was new and coming in. Nixon, except it was Nixon, Ford as a result of Watergate and his resignations. But by the time we got 8 years into the new system, there was this switchback, right? There was this step in a different direction, and that was Carter. Carter won, or seems to have won, the 1976 election. So that was an exception. You just had the sixth system Republican Southern strategy beginning, and then in comes Carter, sort of cleverly playing off the fact that he was a Southerner compared to a lot of the Republicans. So Carter then was not a successful president, and he was swiftly booted out. And then it took Reagan to really consolidate the Republican rule, and it was still into the post-Reagan. A couple of years after Reagan, it was 1994 when the Republican domination was then brought down to the level of Congress. So I think something like that is perfectly feasible, right? You had Watergate 1974, Vietnam defeat 75, then 76 to 80 Carter, and then back to the pattern. Today that would mean Obama, then Trump, then back to the pattern, back to the demographic majorities, and I think more organic, right, more structural political relationships, right, after this fling with bombastic rhetoric, right? So who knows what's going to do it, right? Warfare, I hope not. Bubble economy is eminently feasible, right? If you remove Dodd-Frank and similar things, you're going to have a bubble economy. All right. Now, some interesting questions. The White House and the cabinet, the name game, the plum book, 4,000 posts to fill. 400 of those, I think, have Senate requirements, right? You got to get those approved. That takes a year. And what's the big one, I would say, right off the bat? Who's going to be the White House chief of staff? Some say Bannon of Breitbart. If that is the one, then hold on to your hat, because that is going to be a wild ride. Or the experienced bureaucrat and hack Priebus of Wisconsin. So that's your choice. Let's see. I also wonder, will Trump appoint Democrats to his cabinet, right? Bill Clinton appointed William Cohen as Secretary of Defense. He'd been a Republican senator from Maine. Bush appointed Norman Mineta, Democrat, Secretary of Transportation. Obama appointed Ray LaHood to one of the departments, I think transportation also. So you get the idea. And also, will Trump appoint opposition Republicans? In other words, one of those 16 or 17 people who ran against him. Will he show that he's big enough and magnanimous enough to appoint some of them? Those will be important signs. So again, I think that the likely conflict will be Trump against the ideologues. And in this, Trump may actually turn out to be momentarily better on some of these issues. The ideologues, Pence, Ryan, you know the drill. Trump, of course, pragmatist, no fixed ideology, no fixed beliefs, but hungry for popularity, hungry for legitimacy, hungry perhaps for a second term. Who knows? Maybe not. Now, let's talk about some of these appointments. The big news today, right now, is that Christie is out. His fawning behavior has not been rewarded. He is out as the head of the transition team, and Christie comes in. So this could be, is this a sign of a certain lack of stability? Anyway, Bannon or Priebus? Again, with Bannon, you're going to get the witches' Sabbath. But let's see. How's about the transition team? Some of this is funny. Do you remember Ed Meese with his Adam Smith free trade, free market tie? He's the guy who gave the press conference. I remember it distinctly. 30 years ago, he came out and said Iran, Contra, and Oliver North, and a bunch of other things. Right? So right now, Ed Meese is working on the management and budget transition team. You've also got another blast from the past. Ken Blackwell, the former Secretary of State of Ohio, widely accused of not giving the precise vote count in the year 2004 in Ohio. Right? So Ken Blackwell is the head of the domestic policy transition team. Who knows what this augurs? And then let's look at Chris Kobach of Kansas. I think he's the Attorney General or another state official in Kansas. Kansas, of course, the orbit of the Koch interests, and Kobach has said some kind of disturbing things. He says this is going to be the sharpest transition you've ever had, a 180-degree reversal of policy. All right, now let's go through some of the individuals named. The name game. How about the State Department? Mentioned are Newt Gingrich, Rudy Giuliani also, Bob Corker, Senator from Tennessee. That's the State Department. And we'll be back in just a minute on World Crisis Radio. We're talking about the new White House, the new cabinet staffs. We've just gone through the transition team. Kobach is somebody to watch out for. State Department we've done. NSC could also be some of these people. How about the Treasury? We're going to do the big four, right? State, Treasury, Defense, and Attorney General. Jamie Dimon mentioned for the Treasury. He's a Democrat. That would count as a Democrat. I don't know if that would help anything. How about that guy Menuhin from Goldman Sachs and Soros, who is the finance man for Trump? Carl Icahn has also been mentioned. And now Jeb Hensarling, that opponent of the Export-Import Bank in the House, one of the House committee chiefs. Defense Department, could it be General Flynn, the disgruntled head, former head of the DIA? Would it be Jeff Sessions from Alabama seeking to crown his career with some defense contracts? Might not be the worst, although this person does not excite our confidence. Attorney General, could it be Giuliani? That's increasingly mentioned. And let's go through some other posts. Who could get Health and Human Services? And that's a big one. That's the most money. and that could be Medicare and Social Security and all the rest of it. Some people say Ben Carson, or Governor Scott of Florida, right, because of his for-profit hospital chain, or some say Carson ought to get Department of Education so he can give out Pell Grants, or more likely not give them out. Commerce Department, Lou Eisenberg. This is a very politicized one, Commerce, right? That's usually a party man. Department of Veterans Affairs, Congressman Miller. Department of Homeland Security, would it be Mike McCall, the current House Homeland Security Committee man, or David Clark? Oh boy, this would be an appointment for DHS, right? The sheriff of Milwaukee, the black sheriff of Milwaukee, would he be able to step up to the Department of Homeland Security? That's anybody's guess. At the CIA, ex-Representative Mike Rogers mentioned. He was the head of the House Intelligence Committee until he left Congress. Department of the Interior, how about Harold Hamm, a fracking mogul? Fracking, not the basis of an economic policy. You can't have energy based on fracking. It's backward. It's going to drag you down. Hope Hicks says that all of this is inaccurate. By the way, what I've been giving you is a mixture of New York Times, NBC, and some others, right? And Politico and so forth. Who gets the Republican National Committee? Will it be Corey Lewandowski or David Bossie, responsible for the Citizens United decision, right? He was the outside man and Scalia was the inside man. The White House could also go, Chief of Staff to Kellyanne Conway. 24 individuals are now being vetted for top security clearances, right? Christie Giuliani had them, Christie seeming less likely. And, when you look at the underlying geometry of this, it's government by the billionaires, and we have to point in this context to the Mercer family. They had supported Ted Cruz. Kellyanne Conway was the head of a super PAC in the orbit of the Mercers. Bannon of Breitbart, the Mercers, I think, involved in the ownership of Breitbart, stocks and so forth, part of the orbit in any case. And then you've got the author of the Clinton Cash, who comes from another institute or foundation in the orbit of the Mercers. So it looks like the Mercers are sitting in the catbird seat. What about the Koch brothers? Are they going to be happy with that? Well, they have Pence, but he's got to do something for them. How about the White House spokesperson, right, running the press conferences? Could it be Sean Hannity? Could it be Scotty Nell Hughes? Could it be Omarosa? Could it be Katrina Pearson? I think all of these point towards obvious pitfalls. Other people who want jobs, Peter Thiel might want one. Kushner, the son-in-law, might want one. Again, Bannon, Bossie, we've mentioned, Giuliani. Brad Pascal, I think a cyber operative in the campaign, might be another person. Sessions, we mentioned. Corey Lewandowski. How about Manafort? Is he out for good? And how about Palin? Palin might want the Interior Department. Maybe not gonna get close to it. All right. Now, the last thing to mention is last night we had Lawrence O'Donnell on MSNBC saying that the Electoral College is now obsolete. Alexander Hamilton's attempt to offer a last-ditch line of resistance against tyranny, obsolete. Well, the Electoral College may be obsolete. We'll soon find out. The Electoral College was supposed to be a barrier to, what can we say, to the seizure of power by individuals who lack the qualifications, let's put it that way, in the opinion of the electors. Remember, the electors are not bound. State law may attempt to bind them, right? Faithless electors are prohibited by a number of states, but that can't be enforced because this is an action taking place at the federal level. So in theory, you could have electors saying that this minority president is not suitable and that they might want to act that out in the Electoral College. Now what happens is it's generally around the 15th of December. There is this formula. It's the first Monday after the second Wednesday in the month. Anyway, it's usually mid-December. We'll check the date. And they meet in their state capitals, and that's public. And then at least I think it is, and then they send that in by certified mail to the Speaker of the House, and those are opened when the Congress gets going. And will there be some protest there? You'll remember in 2005, January 2005, it was Senator Boxer of California who stood up and said, I object, I think this is wrong. The Ohio votes were not honestly counted by Ken Blackwell and company. And who knows? It's just an interesting thing. If that does not occur, then I think it is time to say that it's obsolete. But whether it's obsolete or not is still remaining to be seen. So avoid the flight forward. David Brooks of the New York Times says that Trump will quit or be impeached during the first year. You cannot base your perspective on such wild speculation. Right? And again, this is coming from a Republican. David Brooks, why don't you repent of all those years when you were a wheelhorse for the Democratic Party? Liberal wing, doesn't matter. It's all the same. So don't have these magical moments where you think that everything is going to be hunky-dory. It's not likely to be hunky-dory. But once again, like all of the ones I've lived through, it's not the end of the world. And if you begin to look around, right, I'm interested, heartened to hear from Mayor Villaraigosa of Los Angeles, who is trying to build an alternative, right? He wants to run for governor of California, and I think that's extremely interesting. And remember, Leibniz always told us, keep history in mind, right? If you look at Leibniz, he says, this German philosopher around 1700, don't be a momentary mind without memory. In other words, keep in mind the historical context. Mens momentanea sive carens recordationem. Don't be a momentary mind that lacks all reference to the past, all memory. Keep the memory in mind, and you're going to fare better at the current time. And the other watchword from Leibniz, optimism. Not automatic, but progress is always available. So we'll see you next week on World Crisis Radio.